This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, I'll be talking about the life and times of American writer Jack London. I have two experts on that, Leonard Cassuto and Jay Williams, and the conversation will begin when we return. The subject is Jack London. He's a writer that in this early 21st century is somewhat forgotten by a lot of people who a century ago he would have been a big name. And so that's why I wanted to do this show. Leonard Cassuto and Jay Williams are my two guests. They have written much about Jack London, his life and his writing. So as I like to usually do, I give each of the guests a few minutes to tell a little bit about who they are, where they come from, and what their interest in the subject is. So let me start with you, Leonard. If you could just give a little background on yourself and your interest in London.
Okay, so my name's Leonard Cassuto. I've been teaching at Fordham University for 27 years now. I'm a professor of English and American Studies. And I've been teaching Jack London's work on and off for most of those 27 years. I came upon him when I was researching one of the first courses I ever designed, a course on Darwinism, literary Darwinism in English and American literature. And London is an iconic figure in that field. And I started reading London first with interest and then avidly. And that led eventually to my co-editing a book on London and writing articles on him on and off for these many years.
And Jay, if you could give a little background on yourself and your interest in London.
My name is Jay Williams. I'm Senior Managing Editor at Critical Inquiry, which is a humanities journal published by the University of Chicago Press. And I started with Jack London in grad school. I took a seminar with Carl Hovde, a American Lit prof at Columbia, and we were reading, I think the title of the seminar was Forgotten Masters of Naturalism or something like that. And we read Martin Eden. It was the first work by Jack London I had ever read, and everyone in the class hated it. And I was struck by it. I was forcefully moved by it, and by the picture of a proletariat sailor figure who rises to success, ironically conceived in America as a writer. And so out of this deep sense of resentment towards my cohort, I sought to prove them wrong and show what a great author Jack London really was, and wrote a master's thesis on it. Subsequent to that, I wrote my dissertation on the Star Rover, London's 1913 novel, composed in 1913. I've edited and published the Jack London Journal, in which I was happy to publish a great essay on the Sundog Trail by Lenny. And currently I'm involved in writing a 3-volume biography of London called The Author Under Sail, The Imagination of Jack London. The first volume, all 3 volumes are published by the University of Nebraska Press. The first volume came out in 2014. I completed the second volume last year, and I'm at work on the third volume.
Well, you mentioned something that very few people would associate with London these days, a book of his that dealt with science fiction. And I don't think a lot of people, I mean, the cliche, if people remember Jack London today at all, is usually the Arctic, the Yukon, Call of the Wild, White Fang, and maybe To Build a Fire. But he wrote science fiction, he wrote adventure stories, he wrote magazine articles, and he was probably, after maybe Mark Twain, at around the time of the early 20th century, probably the most famous American writer. So let me just ask, how has he fallen into such sort of ill repute or no repute for a lot of people? Because he's not really taught, is he, in high schools or colleges today?
Well, I think London is in some ways a victim of his own ambition. That he was a hugely expansive, systemic thinker who was trying to bring the entire world, the entire universe, into the boundaries of different. Was trying to figure out how things work. Now, one of his contemporaries, Theodore Dreiser, spoke all the time of Dreiser's own desire to figure out how things are organized. That was Dreiser's catchphrase that he returned to again and again. The same phrase could apply to London, who was looking to understand not only how things are organized, but also why they're organized the way they are. And this boundless ambition led him to write an awful lot. And now, you can be a writer who writes very little and produces a pearl now and then, or you can be a writer like London who writes an awful lot, and some of it is remembered and heralded, and some of it is more or less forgotten. Not all of London's work is of equal quality, but when you work a lot, and I sympathize with this, I read a lot myself, I don't always know what's my best stuff, and I'm not sure that London necessarily knew that either. But for London to be remembered for a generous double handful of stories and novels, that puts him in a pretty good place. Most of our great writers have fewer than that.
I agree, and in other ways too. He was his own best victim. He would deliberately write material that was for himself and not for the market. And many of those works are forgotten because they have very little appeal outside a closed community of dedicated socialists. And London constantly lied about his own occupation. And so one of the things you hear repeated very often is that London didn't care about writing. He would rather fly a kite than write a good book. He would rather work on a boat than... And so he actively created this image of himself, not as an author, but as an adventurer. And so Alfred Kaysen comes out and says the greatest story that Jack London ever wrote was the story of his own life. And that phrase has been mimicked by biographers ever since. And most importantly, most recently by Earl Labor, whose biography of London just came out. And it's just simply not true. London, in order to believe that he would rather fly a kite than write a great short story, you have to believe that he didn't spend every day practically of his waking life writing. And why he would lie about that is a very interesting question. But when you say something like that often enough, then people will believe you.
Well, it's also worth pointing out that London was an artist, but as somebody who grew up dirt poor, he was also a businessman, and he wanted to make a living with his pen. And he understood that the writer's image is helpful in selling books, and so he crafted an image that he knew would sell, and that image has dogged him for more than a century.
Yeah, I wanted to talk.
Unintended.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about too the fact that despite his political beliefs, and we'll talk about that a bit later in the interview, he's sort of been lumped in with what could, I guess, be called dead white males, colonialism, American triumphalism, great white hunter kind of tropes. That he was someone that for writers of that day didn't put much stock into what was now called political correctness. How much do you think that rightly or wrongly, that image of London has contributed to sort of his neglect in nowadays?
Well, before we get into that, let me add one more thing about why he's been neglected. Another reason is that he was very much a Western writer. And unlike Stephen Norris Frank Norris and Stephen Green and others, he did not embrace the Eastern literary establishment. He actively rejected it. And in fact, he saw himself more as a citizen of the Pacific Rim, of a nascent conception of the Pacific Rim. And then he decided to become a world author. He established himself as an American author, then he tried to establish himself as a world author in the lines of, say, Joseph Conrad or Turgenev. So, so that's part of his reason for his neglect. And also, I would contest the idea that he's not taught in high schools and at the college level. Lenny, of course, is teaching him. Ken Brandt is teaching him at Savannah Art and Design. I'm sure Jeannie Campbell Reisman is teaching him in Austin. I know Bill Brown here at the University of Chicago has taught him. So, so there is a kind of a sense of London being ignored and using that as a strategy to bring him to light, and it's a bit of a myth. But to return to the question of lumping London into kind of the Nietzschean Superman barbaric author type category, this is a very difficult question, London and race. And I'd like to say at the outset that I know there's at least one website, one American National Socialism website out there that holds Jack London as its hero, the hero of the white race. And I disown that. I'm sure Lenny would. And I just don't believe that if London had lived into the 30s and 40s, that he would have embraced some form of National Socialism or Nazism. I think he would have rejected it out of hand. Even though somebody like a contemporary like Ernest Julius Haldeman Julius, publisher of the Little Blue Books in Girard, Kansas, in his memoir labeled London as a racist and a anti-Semite. I just don't think that's true.
So there's a principle that Jay, I think, is working from the particular towards. Now, it's very easy for us to judge retrospectively our writers and other thinkers and say, this person is disreputable or racist and so on. I think that the question that we really need to be asking when it comes to making those judgments is, was the figure in question more racist than his time or not? And London came of age at a time when books with titles like The Negro a Beast were being written and sold in great numbers. And there's no question that many of London's beliefs would be disreputable by today's standards. But London was not particularly a torchbearer or a breaker of new ground in those areas when he was writing. He was trying to use in the intellectual climate that he was in, he was trying to draw everything in, and he was trying to make sense of the world that he was living in, which is what intellectuals do, and also artists. The question of whether he was more disreputable in his beliefs than the people around him, I think the answer is clearly no. He was not a progressive by these standards either, and those critics who try to defend him as a progressive wearing racist clothes, I think, do London no favors. But I think that when we're talking about London as an artist, he was an artist who was clearly concerned with what we would today call identity politics, not only race but also gender. He was fascinated with the sexual essentialism, whether it existed and in what forms might it play out, and in terms of sex and gender, he might even be considered progressive for his time. But the point is that London cannot be separated from his time when we talk about these issues, because the issues were of a time.
Correct. It's obvious that there were men of his time who were progressive racially. And he knew them well, and he hung out with them. William English Walling is one of them, a co-founder of the NAACP. There were socialists who believed that you had to take the phrase brotherhood of man quite literally. And London's attitude towards the concept of the Brotherhood of Man changed. And in 1899, early on in his career, he disavowed it. In 1904, he supported it, and he continued to support it throughout the rest of his career. But London relied on certain understandings of biology, and for London, biology trumped just about everything. So there's that famous moment when he comes home from Korea and he's at a socialist meeting, an Oakland socialist meeting in November 1904, and people are asking him about his attitudes toward the Japanese and towards Koreans, and he says, by God, I'm a white man first and a socialist second. 2 months later, he's writing a letter to the Alameda branch of the Socialist Party saying, way to give money to strikers in upstate New York. That exemplifies the phrase brotherhood of man. So clearly there was a change in his thinking towards the intersection of race and politics, and it's a very interesting question to develop.
I want to end this first segment talking about another charge that's always been labeled against London, and I think has had a detriment on the viewpoint of people in this century, and that's the charge of plagiarism. And I recently did a show actually on the rock group Led Zeppelin, and their founding members are now being sued for supposedly plagiarizing portions of songs, and generally they did steal a lot of material from other people without creditation. But London was one of those people that I think settled a few lawsuits from people that he openly admitted that he stole whole passages from. But if nowadays, if you look at, especially like historians, a number of historians, Stephen Ambrose, Doris Kearns Goodwin, have gotten into some major trouble over this. Let me ask you both about the claims of plagiarism against London, his admission of such, and was they direct plagiarism, or was it more what I call sometimes stealing? I often tell young writers, you often have to steal from the best. That you could take a great line in a poem from a Robert Frost and another great poet. You mix them two together in some way, and you get something new. So, were the charges of plagiarism against London founded, well-founded, or what?
Well, there's a couple of. I don't think he was ever sued for plagiarism. And he certainly never had to go to court for it. I wouldn't put him in a class of Stephen Ambrose. He's a fiction writer, and London believed that, and Joseph Conrad said this after London died, there's always a substratum of fact in London's work, and London found that substratum of fact in newspapers. So one of the famous so-called cases of plagiarism is the Iron Heel, where he lifted a speech directly from a newspaper and incorporated it nearly word for word in the Iron Heel. And then later, an author named Frank Harris wrote to London and said, what's going on here? That was my fictional work. And London said, guilty, but I thought it was nonfiction, and nonfiction is legitimate game for a fiction writer. So there's that question. And then there's this other part. London was a plagiarist because he didn't have an original idea in his head, and that connects to his overproduction. And so at some point in his career, he had just written himself out, and so he was just stealing material from everybody. I just don't think that's true.
So it's worth two things are worth pointing out. First, in connection with what Jay said, another pungent example. Theodore Dreiser's masterpiece, An American Tragedy, which came out in 1925, is based on a real-life murder case from 1906. Dreiser changes an enormous number of the facts. It's clearly fiction. Nevertheless, in the novel, Dreiser incorporates the letters from the murdered woman that she wrote to her to the man she thought was going to marry her. They were read out at the 1906 trial, where they made a sensation, and they were also sold as a pamphlet. Dreiser incorporates those letters word for word into the novel. Does that make Dreiser a plagiarist? Well, no one made that accusation.
Yeah.
In part because, as Jay suggests, this was nonfiction and therefore fair game. And Dreiser presumably felt he couldn't improve on the original wording. So there is a sense that when you're making art, you make art out of experience, and experience is real, and people can use the same experience. But London was perhaps more careless than he should have been, and there is also the undeniable fact that in the latter part of his writing life, he purchased plots that from others, notably Sinclair Lewis, that he would turn into stories and then destroy the originals, and in effect take credit for something. But he bought them. They were his. Lewis was his employee in that scenario, and Lewis never accused London of plagiarism in that sense, and presumably London made over the idea and gave it his own signature. Certainly, the stories that we know London, the stories whose plots we know London purchased from Lewis, when we read them, we can't imagine, we don't hear Lewis's voice. It's London's voice. So the art speaks in the language of the artist. And I think that when we're talking about issues like plagiarism, it's not that we should ignore them, it's that we should be considering them within a nuanced context.
So it was more along the lines of, say, Lawrence Stern and I think Life of Tristram Shandy, where he took snippets and stuff from other people and sort of incorporated them in a collage-like way. You know, is that more along the lines of what you'd say London had done?
Well, yeah, it's that, but also any examination of this relation between his source material and his final product has to look at how London conceived of the relationship between fiction and nonfiction, between truth and falsehood, between ultimately what is the power of language and how capable is it of representing reality, and London was always fascinated by that question. And he was always searching for the best possible genre or mixes of genre, not just to get the truth out, but to get the emotion correct. And so if he needed to use somebody else's words to convey that emotion, the emotion was his, as Lenny was talking about. The voice of the artist comes out of that art, and we hear London's voice. He has a very distinctive writerly voice.
Well, let's end this segment. In the next segment, I want to talk a little bit about London's background, his youth, biography, and then into the major works. And we'll do that in a moment. I am talking with Leonard Cassuto and Jay Williams about the life and times of American writer Jack London. We spoke a little bit in broad strokes in the prior segment. I want to get sort of to the nitty-gritty of London. He was born in the mid-1870s. He only lived about 4 decades. Let's talk about the milieu he was born into. What kind of a family did he come from? Where was he born? What was the social milieu that he was born into, and that sort of thing. So I don't know, Jay, if you want to start.
Sure. He was born in 1876 in San Francisco. His parents, Flora Wellman and William Cheney, were astrologists, spiritualists, deeply embedded in the margins of American society, both by occupation and by artistic production. In some way, I do look at them as artists. I think London learned what the artistic imagination was from his mother. His father, of course, left and denied his paternity. So London basically grew up in the, do I want to say slums of Oakland? I guess so, in very poor sections of Oakland, both rural poor and urban poor. And his stepfather, John London, had a couple of daughters, one of whom, Eliza Shepherd, was eventually named Eliza Shepherd, was very close to Jack and and would ultimately end up as sharing the responsibilities of his estate with his second wife, Charmian, after Jack died in 1916. He took the odd job in factories, but he also he gravitated towards the open air and the sea. He learned how to sail a boat very early in life and became an expert small boat sailor on San Francisco Bay. One of his earliest jobs was as a newspaper boy, as many of us had a newspaper route. So did Jack. But he stayed in the newspaper world and as he grew in the Bay Area, he made a lot of friends with newspaper editors on both sides of the Bay, both in Oakland and in San Francisco. And so that was very much a formative a part of his life. He was a voracious reader. His close boyhood friend, Frank Atherton, remembers him going out for recess at Cole Elementary School in Oakland and sitting on a bench and reading a book. He was involved in the written word very early in life. And so, you can't help but mention the importance of the Oakland Public Library as well in his life. Apparently, he checked out every single book out of that library, or nearly every single book.
Was he, would you say, in the strain?
I want to add two dates to that rich collage of detail that Jay just provided. The first date is 1850. That's the date that California became a state. So London was born in 1876. California had been a state for about one generation. Jay spoke earlier about how London self-identified as a Western writer, and the majority of the American population was living in the eastern half of the country. So California in 1876 was in no sense what California is today. It was more green than asphalt. In connection with that, the second date is 1869. 1869 was the date that the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. That before 1869, in order to get any goods from the East Coast to the West Coast, you had to transfer from a train to a stagecoach at some point and go through land that in some cases was hostile, filled with Native Americans who were understandably angry at the encroachment on their lands. So only in 1869 was a transcontinental railroad line established that went coast to coast. It was a notable occasion. But if you think about the fact that before then, the goods could not be transported from coast to coast in the same volume and quantity, it gives you a sense of the way that the West Coast was comparatively isolated compared to the East Coast. And that's a milieu for London. The West Coast was only just in London's time becoming a major trade partner with the rest of its own country.
I've often thought of London sort of in the 19th century vein with writers such as Whitman in terms of being a newspaper man, an adventurer like Melville was, and sort of this self-promoter type that was exemplified best by Mark Twain. Let's talk about his journalism, because I believe he wasn't initially first published, writing for local newspapers, and then he did branched out more into fiction.
That's correct. He first published letters to the editor I believe it was the Oakland Tribune. I know it's one of the Oakland papers, about single tax, about public ownership of utilities, burning social questions of the day. He used the newspapers initially as a way to develop his own political beliefs, and later on, he became more of a feature writer. This was a time when William Randolph Hearst was seen as a progressive, and identified with the working man. So London saw Hearst, at least initially, as a compatriot. And so he felt no compunction about taking assignments from Hearst. And the assignments that he took, on the face of it, seemed rather odd. He covered a 6-day shooting match in 1902, in the summer of 1902. He interviewed Governor Taft coming back from the Philippines. Um, but he was a feature writer, and that's the kind. I don't think London. I don't know if the lead as a journalistic concept existed at that point. I think not. But London could never write a lead. He just didn't think that way. He wrote expository material in the newspaper. So, for example, he covered sporting events, especially boxing. And one of his earliest boxing reports starts out with practically an essay about what is the primitive in man? What does it mean to say primordial? And at least one critic said, I want to know what happened in the boxing match. I don't want to know what the word primordial means.
It's to that it's worth pointing out as well that London continued to do take the occasional journalistic assignment even after he became a celebrity fiction writer, and that's not only interesting in its own right, but it's interesting in that when London was covering some of these events, again boxing matches, he were among those. He sometimes became the story himself. So when London was covering the much heralded match between Jack Johnson and James Jeffries, his coverage was written about as news by other journalists. So you had wheels within wheels. Yeah. So London not only never left journalism, but journalism also embraced London from the other end.
He, I know, was a war correspondent during the Russo-Japanese War. Did he cover any of the other wars of that era, like the war in the Philippines? You'd mentioned he'd interviewed a government official coming back from it, or like the Boer War. Was he globetrotting, or was he more concerned with American concerns?
Well, he did try to cover the Boer War in 1902, as Frank Norris had, and thought of Frank Norris as a model in that way. He was frustrated in that endeavor and ended up writing People of the Abyss, kind of a blend of journalism and sociology, a report from the slums of London and the state of the British Empire as seen from the bottom. But he did cover the Mexican Revolution in 1914, and I think that's about the only combat, if you can call it combat, that he actually saw. He did try to make arrangements to go overseas to Europe to cover World War I, but it was too complicated for him.
About People of the Abyss, that it was a kind of second choice assignment, but it also brings to mind something Jay said earlier about the substrate of fact that underlies all of London's work. That People of the Abyss, there are many London scholars, including me, who consider it right up there with his very best work, and it has not simply the basis in documentary fact. London disguised himself as a member of the poor of London's East End and went out and lived among them. But it also that personal experience becomes a jumping off point for a work of real artistry, of searching inquiry that's not only still readable today, but is in many ways even more as relevant today as when it was first written.
Let me ask about the political views of how they evolved within London. He's well known, of course, for being a socialist. Some people even tried to lump him in, I guess, as an anarchist. He came up in that generation of the last decade of the 19th century, where you had people like Jacob Riis his famous photographs of the New York poor. You had a decade later, you had a lot of writings about the social conditions, both in fictive and non-fictive work in the U.S. at the turn of the century. Would it be fair to say that he was also in that muckraker mold, that he loved to plumb into social issues, and was that where his ideas came from, or did he plunge into them because of his beliefs?
I'd call London more of an activist than a muckraker. That the he was he came to a lot of these issues from his commitments, and his socialism. Much has been written about his socialism with good reason. He was the creator of his own brand of socialism, what he called individualistic socialism, informed by his own wide reading as well as by the party doctrines of the time. But London was more of a writer than he was a politician. He was never successful in his runs for political office, and his political writing is fascinating, but it isn't doctrinaire in any way. That London was trying to find his own truth and then write it down so that other people could read it and engage with it. But that's not necessarily the stuff of party politics, which involves a certain amount of discipline and of as London's successor Richard Wright found, also discipline and subordination to a greater cause. London claimed to be following the cause of socialism, and in many ways, of course, he was. But the socialism that London followed was a work that was perpetually under construction because London was himself a searching artist.
Right. Yeah. So probably his most famous socialist work, or short socialist work, is Revolution, the speech that he gave on his lecture tour in 1905-06. And it's inspirational and aspirational. And that was the role that he conceived for himself. He didn't think of himself as he had a complicated relationship to electoral politics. He didn't think the coming brotherhood of man would be won by political machinations. He thought it would be won by revolution, the violent overthrow of the American government, basically. At the same time, he did not embrace anarchism. He rejected Ben Reitman and Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. They were friends. They were partners in advancing progressive political causes. But he was no bomb thrower. He didn't see himself in that role. He didn't think that served any end except to prod the bear of capitalism into greater and more vicious oppression. So he used language to expose the real ideology of capitalism. That was his goal.
On a personal level, there's this sort of caricature, a stereotype even. I'd mentioned of London, sort of this, the great white hunter kind of stereotype that was around in that day, sort of this, idea that he represented the colonial U.S. But even more personally, he had a reputation as a drinker, a gambler, a womanizer. He was married a couple of times, and this played right into the hands, it seems, of the people of his era who basically wrote his personal epitaph artistically, that he basically committed suicide because he was a drinker. There have been people who talked about some of the suicides listed in some of his fictional works. Let's talk about the personal side of London, his own personal angsts, if you will, his relationships, and then ultimately his death and his use of drugs and alcohol.
As writers will do, London mined his personal experience for his art, and take the drinking. That London was living, working, and writing at a time before alcoholism was medicalized. So that is to say, we think of alcoholism now as a sickness, but in London's time, it was seen as a moral failing, and it was attacked as a sign of weak character or worse. And so for London to write a memoir in which he comes out as an alcoholic, we need to understand that was a far more consequential admission in terms of personal risk than anybody saying the same thing today would be exposing themselves to. The London was it's hard to find something to compare it to. It was an enormous admission, and London was frank about his drinking problem and the ways that he came to it and how he was trying to fight it. But I think that when we look at that, we need to put it into the context of his time and realize just how brave it was, and also how such an act is so clearly indicates the kinds of commitments that London was making, so that to his writing, to his art, that he was willing even to expose himself to the kind of castigation that an admission of alcoholism could bring at the turn of the century.
The novel, or memoir, is called John Barleycorn Alcoholic Memoirs. And it starts off with him and his wife discussing women's rights. And London says, "I hope that women get the right to vote." And his wife says, "Why? I thought you were against that." He said, "Well, if women get the right to vote, the saloons will close. They will close the saloons." And she said, "But I thought you were a friend to John Barleycorn." And he says, "I am. I was. I'm not." And it's one of the great lines about alcoholism. It's both the disease and the denial of the disease, and he captures it beautifully. He captures, his emphasis seems to be on all the beautiful moments that he had when drinking, but also on the terrifying aspects of drinking. And it's probably the first full-blown American drunkalogue ever, and it should be required reading. It's one of the great unforgotten works by Jack London, for sure.
One of the reasons that sort of thing is forgotten is because the temperance movement, the temperance movement is one of the three great reform movements of the 19th century, along with abolitionism, which morphed into civil rights, and the women's movement, which morphed into feminism. And both abolitionism and the women's movement have known their shares of successes and failures, and the struggles that they represented go on. The temperance movement achieved complete success in 1920 with the passage of Prohibition. It proved to be an ironic success, of course, that Prohibition led to, among other things, the flourishing of organized crime, and as we well know, it was rolled back. And the temperance movement has never been the same. It's been a victim of its own success. But at the time that London was writing, at the turn of the century, the temperance movement was a cause that brought roaring commitments from people from reformers of all stripes. And London's memoir is in many ways a particular instance of what was a general trend of great consequence.
Well,
and he was not shy about making allies across the political spectrum. So a novel like The Star Rover seems like pure science fiction, but at the same time, it's one of the strongest statements against capital punishment and against a corrupt penal institution in America that I know of, and it's part of London's legacy today, most emphatically. And in order to get his message, his anti-capital punishment message, his penal reform message across, he felt he needed to enlist the help New Thought advocates. So theosophists and spiritualists of every stripe were also progressive in their social politics. They just happened to believe in this odd conception of a power greater than oneself. London didn't care about that odd conception. He just wanted to form bonds with as many different groups as possible in order to reform the American penal institution.
Now, London was married a couple of times, I believe, and I know he was an outspoken atheist. Talk a little bit about sort of his personal domestic side, if you would.
London was a romantic. He
exactly.
he married for love, especially the second time, and I guess what needs to be said here is that London's marital adventures and misadventures were taking place at a time much more strict than today. His divorce was tabloid fodder because he was a famous writer by that time, and his flirtations were as well. But he proved when he found the right one, he could be as conventional as the next person, at least after his own fashion, because he settled down to a life of adventure with his what he called his mate woman.
Yeah, I mean, the reports of having an affair with a woman in Hawaii are circumstantial. Later in life, in 1914, 15, and 16, are circumstantial. Charmian's affair with a novelist reporter named Dunn are circumstantial and probably true. Nonetheless, they both were romantics. They deeply loved each other. I think London relied more on the care and help of Charmian than Charmian would lean on London. It was that kind of relationship, I think, except perhaps professionally. Though Charmian was an accomplished artist and writer in her own right, she did write a 2-volume biography of Jack and published in 1922, and other works as well. But he didn't meet a woman he didn't like, I think. And women liked London because he liked women. And so there's just scores and scores of women who fell in love with him, not because, he was an attractive physical presence. When he entered a room, he was like Bill Clinton. He entered a room and all eyes gravitated towards him. He was a magnetic personality, and women dug it, and they dug him, and he dug them right back. And yeah.
We should also remember that in the time before electronic mass media, that is London's time, before even radio, that that matinee idols were made in print. That London was photogenic, and he was a writer of popular adventure stories. He was living the life as well as writing the life. He was a sex symbol, and it's hard for us to think of writers as sex symbols because we have so much more immediate access today to the images of our icons. But London was not simply a writer of important literature. He was a hugely famous celebrity in America in the first decade of the 20th century, first decade and a half of the 20th century.
It seems like every point of interest in London's life and work generates two polar opposites. How can you be a public intellectual and a national sex symbol? But London was. How can you be a millionaire and a socialist? There were other millionaire socialists, Wilshire and others, but London again was. It just makes for fascinating study and and research.
Before we move on to his work, let's just deal with the issue of his death, because as I mentioned, there have been people who have claimed he killed himself, uh, and others not. Generally speaking, most people, I would say, the consensus is that it wasn't a suicide; it was just an accidental morphine-induced death. Where do you guys stand on that?
Well, I will start. I'll start only to say that the rumors of London's suicide stem from the careless work of an early biographer, which has been corrected by the work of later biographers. Now, Jay, you can take it from there.
Well, I disagree completely. I think you're referring to Irving Stone.
Yeah, right.
And his biography, Sailor on Horseback. He was, the first edition was simply Jack London, Sailor on Horseback. He was pressured by the estate to change it to, I think, fictional biography or something along those lines. But Stone's biography, as fault-ridden as it is, nonetheless, he had access to people no one else had access to, and because they were alive then. And one of those people was Dr. Thompson, who was the first medical person to arrive on the death scene, or the near-death scene. It took Jack all day to die, basically. And his first report, as he revealed in Stone's notes for the biography, which are housed at Berkeley, he entered the room. He saw a man with labored breathing, face blue. He immediately recognized it as a morphine overdose and prescribed and sent an assistant down to the village of Glen Ellen to get tools to pump his stomach. Later on, the family doctor, Dr. Porter, arrived on the scene. According to Dr. Thompson, Porter immediately went into a separate room with Jack's wife, Charmian, and they came out and said the cause of death is uremic poisoning. And Thompson went along with the fiction. A number of years later, Thompson retracted his statement and said, no, it was indeed uremic poisoning. So just about every account, contemporary or otherwise, holds some contradiction in it. And we'll never know how Jack died.
One thing is clear, though. He was really sick.
Oh, absolutely true. And he had been sick for quite some time. After the Snark voyage, or during the last stage of the Snark voyage in 1909, he was hospitalized in Australia with a mysterious illness, which many people believe to have been the result of mercury poisoning, because he was treating ailments that he had contracted during the voyage with mercury, and which he continued to do for a number of years. He was addicted to morphine. He was a chain smoker. He drank like a fish. He lived regardless of the consequences of his acts and suffered accordingly.
You could say that he died at age 40 of old age by living twice as much in half the time.
In Jack London time, a year equal. He was like a dog. Yeah. Amazingly enough.
Well, let me turn to his works now, since that's basically why we are doing this show. I want to start with his short stories, and in a sense, to me, London was always sort of the American or North American equivalent of someone like Chekhov, except he was far more diverse in his tales. I mean, he wrote adventure stories. He wrote stories that were centered in the South. He wrote what would later be called pulp fiction type stories, science fiction. I think he had an enormous influence on, the science fiction kind of writers from the Edgar Rice Burroughs kind of people onward into what we consider the classic 1930 stuff. But generally speaking, most people again sort of looked to Build a Fire or some of these sort of Yukon sort of centric stories. Let's talk a little bit about his short fiction and the utter diversity of it.
Well, I think the first thing you have to say is that he was a Klondike writer. He was a dog writer. I mean, and I'm perfectly happy to own up to that label for him. I don't think a year passed without him writing a story set in the Klondike. There was an absolute fascination with it, and it's, I think, easily explained. He found his source of inspiration, his muse, didn't live on the top of Mount Olympus. It lived in a hellhole in the middle of the white north, at the bottom of which you would find three things: dice, representing chance or gambling, or the inexplicable operations of the universe. You find the written word, usually as the last testament of the miner who lived at the bottom of this pit, saying, I found the richest vein of gold in the world, and now I can't spend it because I'm going to die, and gold. And that's how he conceived of his imagination, as some malevolent spirit that lived in the middle of the wilderness that came to haunt and torture him and make him write stories. So, of course, he wrote a ton of Klondike stories.
So London escaped. London used the phrase "hellhole" in his correspondence, in his writing. He saw his life as an escape from hellholes. One of his famous socialist pieces, "Why I Became a Socialist," it's not really about why socialism is so great. It's about what a hellhole capitalist labor can be, particularly for the less fortunate. And he considered himself lucky to have escaped it and into the life and work of a writer. I guess so. What I'm getting at here is that in the Klondike, in the Northland, London found an atmosphere that was analogous to the kind of narrative of overcoming, this narrative of struggle to get out of the hellhole. That was the story that he wanted to tell, that he told over and over again. And so the Klondike became the epitome of that, and he could tell that story, the story of being in the hellhole, from numerous points of view, including that of native tribes. And when London moved away from the Northland and started searching for other subjects, he found stories of struggle in all kinds of places. He found them in the workplace, for example, in the story "The Apostate," about a child who is conscripted into factory work, which all but kills him. He found it in a leper colony in Hawaii. London was always looking for hellholes, and as an adventurer in real life, he was finding them everywhere, and he could tell different kinds of hellhole stories of overcoming or of failing to overcome, in milieu that ranged from not simply frozen Alaska, but could range all the way from there to the boxing ring.
Right, and of course, the principal trope for him was the abyss. And it could be a white abyss of the north. It could be the abyss that he talks about in the East End of London, the people of the abyss, American abysses, Hawaiian abysses. They existed everywhere. I did want to point out, I don't know if we can do this or not, but the cover of the first edition of Paul of the Wild, I was just thinking, can I do this?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Here's the cover of the first edition of Paul of the Wilds. Supposedly the quintessential Klondike tale, right?
Yeah.
And what we see is I think, exactly what we're talking about. We're seeing dogs being beaten, dogs used as labor being beaten by men with whips and clubs. And so what you might think of as just a story about a dog who goes from a civilized state to a wild or primordial state is the story actually of a dog who escapes the economic sphere of capitalism and ends up in the free wild life of a economic lifestyle. kind of like a bohemian artist that London saw himself as. And so this is kind of a theme at work in his short fiction, and his longer fiction as well. One of the great things about his short fiction is that I have found no documentary evidence that he read Rudyard Kipling's short stories while he was learning to craft the short story, as he was learning the finer points of the genre. He read poetry, and he read Kipling's poetry quite extensively. The two short story writers I think that he was most influenced by, and I'm sure Lenny would comment on this as well, is Edgar Allan Poe and Ambrose Bierce. And this I think ties into your interest in him as a science fiction writer. I don't know if I would label him as a science fiction writer, and more of a apocalyptic gothic writer or some label like that. But yeah.
Would you put him in sync with utopianists?
More of a dystopian writer, if anything.
Dystopian. Leonard, what were you going to say?
Well, take a look at one of his final short stories, the Red One, where an anthropologist discovers a pulsating red sphere in a South Seas island. Like many of London's stories, they suggest an otherworldliness that we would label science fiction. And certainly he thought about the future, and certainly he did a lot of research on contemporary conceptions of Mars, for example. He was thinking about writing a novel called A Farthest Distant, which in interesting ways overlaps with the writing of The Iron Heel.
Which is in its own way a dystopian contemplation.
Exactly, and so it's really he's more of a futurist, I would think, and more often than not, the future looks pretty bad. The Scarlet Plague is a great example,
or the Yellow Peril,
yeah, exactly. There always in the future there seems to be gigantic, uncontrollable forces that are going to destroy us, whether we like it or not.
But through it all, Jay mentioned Bierce and Poe, and Bierce and Poe are writers who chose extravagant setting in the service of emotional effect. And London was always seeking those things.
Right. Yeah, right. I mean, a lot of his stuff, because if you go to like Project Gutenberg or the Internet Archive, all of his stuff now is in the public domain. And, if you could just go through his short stories, and lesser known fiction, the idea, one of the things that most strikes me is that the idea that people have of London is just a small portion of what he actually wrote about, because there are these short stories that you've mentioned that are certainly in the vein of the H.G. Wells approach of the future. Something like Things to Come from H.G. Wells seems very in sync with a lot of the thoughts that London had about the future, as you mentioned as well. But he also, dipped into the past. If we look at the novel Before Adam, I mean, here's a guy writing about, a caveman from a caveman point of view. And even though certainly now, 100+ years later, we know certain things scientifically aren't correct, but the imagination to write a story about that is something that really only Jack London in that age would have been doing.
London was constrained by neither time nor place.
That's true. And the first line of that book, Before Adam, indeed, it is. It's about primitive life and the preeminent emotion of primitive life, which is fear. Men lived in trees, and they were scared to death of falling out of trees, and so this somehow became a dream common to all humanity, as London understood it. We're hardwired to fear falling out of trees because that's who our ancestors were. But that first line of Before Adam, so that's the book, right? And so you would expect the first line to be something other than what it is, which is pictures, pictures, pictures. And the book is really about the transmission of knowledge from previous generations to our current generation. How do we know the things that we know? How does our body know the things that it knows? And how is that knowledge passed on from generation to generation?
London was studying memes before Dawkins coined the term. The biologist Richard Dawkins, who talks about cultural transmission in terms of units that he calls memes. And you can see the through line as well, from London's cavemen to his dogs to his people, because ultimately London was seeking a coherent universe. He was trying to put everything together into a giant unity. And where we began is that London's efforts to do that are not only reflect his ambition as a writer, but his successes and also his failures together.
Then we get right back to what you started with at the beginning of this talk. He was an organizer in a time when the theory of everything was predominant. So Herbert Spencer was influential for London, but not in its particulars, but in Spencer's attempt to systematize all knowledge and to link together seemingly incompatible spheres of epistemology, the knowable and the unknowable. And London thought this was a worthy endeavor to try to explain everything with a coherent philosophy.
And this is one of the most important sources. Herbert Spencer, it's worth mentioning, Spencer was a hero to intellectuals of the right and the left in London's time. He's in disrepute now because as a systemic thinker, he was not particularly interested in evidence. In fact, one of the waggish responses to Spencer later is that somebody said Herbert Spencer's idea of a tragedy is a theory that is contradicted by a fact. And Spencer was a theorist of enormous expanse in London. London probably has to take second to him in that respect. But Spencer influenced the intellectuals of his time in England and America, as well as elsewhere. And you can see his fingerprints on a lot of London's thinking, and therefore a lot of London's art. You see the same in Norris and Dreiser, and also Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was a thoroughgoing Spencerian. He saw the kind of monopoly capitalism that prevailed in the post-war era in the United States as a fulfillment of Spencerian ideals. So when we're talking about where London came from and where London's aesthetics, what London's aesthetics drew on, you really should be mentioning Spencer.
Right, and it's important to note, London rejected Spencer's anti-socialism, and in that regard, differed in a huge way, differed from Spencer.
The Cruise of the Dazzler, I wanted to talk about that because I remember reading that book when I was 4, 5, 6 years old, when I had a book that contains like 5 or 6 great boys' novels along with Tom Sawyer and Treasure Island. That was a story that I always thought had a lot more depth than even the Tom Sawyers and the Treasure Islands, which are probably more well-known works. It's very much sort of almost Treasure Island on steroids in the sense that it goes deeper. There's harsher realities in that book. There isn't sort of it's considered, I guess, a kids, a young adult book maybe today would be considered, but it's much grittier. Was that his first published work? Well, as a book,
no,
rather.
not by a long shot. I think he had published at least 2 collections of short stories before Cruise of the Dazzler, Son of the Wolf and God of His Fathers, which were published, were written in 1898, 1899. Cruise of the Dazzler has an interesting publication history. And when he submitted it for book publication, George Brett at Macmillan asked him to expand it, and he expanded it by adding um, a bit of material about an American abyss, about, if I'm remembering correctly, the main character encounters slum children, and they have a battle in the San Francisco abyss, which doesn't appear in its original serialized form. Um, so, it's again, it's one of these books by London that appears on the surface to be one thing, and Dan, as you were saying, once you dig into it, it has much more depth and quite a strong social message.
I've not read The Daughter of the Snows, but I know that's got a female protagonist. Was London particularly adept at writing feminine characters, or was he, typical of that day where of male writers where they were just sort of appendages?
I wouldn't say I'm the biggest fan of London's female characters.
Neither am I. And somebody like Mary Austen, a novelist, a great novelist in her own right, and a friend of London's, didn't think much of his portrayal of women either. Um, the interesting thing is that the equal status that they have his work. Um, and, we have to remember that after he wrote Daughter of the Snows, he wrote the Kempton Waste Letters without a contract, completely on spec, in collaboration with his good friend and romantic interest, Anna Strunsky, who later married William English Welling. And so there's always a sense in London's work, I think, of holding women up as equals, certainly in terms of occupation and other things that mental people in every way of life. So, Daughter of the Snows, you get a character, Frona Wells, who's an adventurer and a hard-charging woman who is very much of a character right out of an Ibsen play. Intentionally, London knew Ibsen backwards and forwards and read Ibsen out loud among his friends. Ibsen is a Doll's House is a strong influence on that book. Unfortunately, it was his first book. He had no idea how to write a novel. It completely falls apart in terms of structure. In fact, Frona Wells disappears for much of the latter half of the novel, and it wasn't so much about the treatment of the women characters in that book as it was that he just didn't know how to handle the form.
So Hawthorne, to name one of London's illustrious forebears, Hawthorne suppressed his early work after he became famous because he didn't want to be remembered by it. London, who as a child of poverty was always interested in making money and not leaving things on the table that could be sold, would not do that. So we have a much fuller record of London's self-styled apprenticeship. He taught himself to write, and he sold everything. Everything that could sell, he sold. And it's hard to argue with his reasoning that he wanted to eat. But if we are, and he never got out of the habit of making money. That Jay talked about London's first two collections of short stories. Well, London's style was always to sell a short story to the magazines, and then collect it in a book so that he could sell it a second time. And any writer for money, Samuel Johnson said, no writer ought to write but for money. London took that pretty seriously, and as a result, his output can be uneven, including Daughter of the Snows. But I think it's fair to say that you're not going to find too many critics, readers, scholars who are going to defend London's female characters.
Well, probably the three most famous books that are usually bundled together in like modern collections of works are the novels Call of the Wild, The Sea Wolf, and White Fang. And probably so much has been written and spoken about that you could probably find online. So I don't want to spend too much on these that are probably his three most famous works to the modern reader, at least. But what could, if you just want to give some brief thoughts on these three works that form sort of the central idea of what we now today think of as London.
I would flip White Fang out and replace it with Martin Eden, even though you're of course correct, Dan, that that the three titles you mentioned are the best known. But White Fang is in some ways a philosophical recapitulation of the Call of the Wild, an exercise where instead of talking about the journey from civilized to wild, he's doing the journey from wild to civilized. But if I'm going to talk about London's signature work, then I'll mention Call of the Wild and some of the Northland stories, The Sea Wolf and Martin Eden, as describing a kind of arc where he becomes more contemplative, more, and in some ways more despairing of the effort to escape the hellhole. That Martin Eden escapes it economically, but he still can't. But emotionally, he can't get out of it. He's Martin Eden is, by today's standards, a depressed person. The Sea Wolf and Call of the Wild, by contrast, are fabulistic. That they describe a journey to a kind of existential contentment, a state of living happily ever after, by making that you gain by making the right choices and surviving the struggle.
One of the things that people said, reviewers said about Daughter of the Snow, is that the woman was completely unbelievable, that no woman like that could possibly exist. Somebody who could break trail in the north and recite poetry by heart and know Robert Browning and so forth. And the same thing was said about now I'm blanking on her name in The Sea Wolf, Maud Brewster, who again is somebody who could live on a desert island and not only not get kicked off, but survive by eating bugs and flowers, but also is a renowned, not just a poet, but a renowned American poet, and a great lover to boot. And so that's one of the things about The Sea Wolf that you have to contend with. As great as it is, and most people think it's great because of the realization, the complete 3D realization of a character like Wolf Larsen. At the same time, you have this moment where a woman shows up out of nowhere, a love interest develops, and the novel ends happily ever after. So that's been the crux of critical debate about the Sea Wolf, which I agree. I would regard it as one of his great works and best known. I do hope Martin Eden gets more of a play because it's more representative of the totality of London's work. It's as London's work is so involved in retelling or recasting or trying to explain the process of artistic creation. And you look at the number of author figures in London's work, they're just all over the place. They're either storytellers or actually writers. And Sea Wolf is a prime example of that. Two writers meet in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So Martin Eden embodies that thematic. He is the author who fails, spectacularly fails, spectacularly succeeds, and spectacularly fails. And it's also about the proletariat. It's about class issues. It's about everything. And Martin Eden, I think, it'd be the one book you would go to if you were to read. If you hadn't read Jack London, that's the book you should start with.
It was a few years ago when I was reading some of London's works on Project Gutenberg that I became impressed with what I think his influence was on genres outside of what's generally ascribed to him. And I want to talk about two works particularly. One of them you had mentioned before, The Scarlet Plague, seems to me to be a forerunner of not only the dystopian novels, but if you look at like the end of the world kind of films of the 1950s, the science fiction films, this certainly seems to be a forerunner to that. And the other one you had also mentioned, The Iron Heel. I don't know how familiar either of you are with science fiction. I'm not a great science fiction fan myself, but there's a book called a fellow named Olaf Stapleton wrote called The First Men, and then also the Asimov Foundation series, where we're looking out centuries ahead of time. And when I read Iron Heel, I could see elements that these later writers certainly borrowed from London. And so his influence both in the dystopian and also sort of the future history kind of novels in the science fiction genre seems to be quite a bit underrated. Can you talk a little bit about either of those books and writers who may have been influenced by that or other of his works?
Well, it's been a long time since I've read The Scarlet Plague, so I think I'll pass on that, except in the general comments I made before. The Iron Heel.
Me too.
I mean, it's a really interesting concept, and general plague destroys the human race except for a few people. It's the template for many a disaster action movie today. And the Iron Heel, though, I'm not a big fan of science fiction either. And my understanding with London and the Iron Heel is that it's set in the future, or at least the frame of the story is set in the future, because that's when London thought the Brotherhood of Man would actually occur. It wouldn't happen in 10, 20 years, in 1936 or 1946. It would happen in 2200 or something like that. And so by creating that future world, he's able to comment on the state of affairs in America in the early 20th century. That's the whole point of setting it in the future.
So there's an old saw about both historical novels that is set in the past and science fiction, so often set in the future, that science fiction and historical novels are always about the present in which they're written, which is not surprising because the author who is writing is in a present and is being motivated by and affected by the events that are going on in his or her present. And so, of course, the Iron Heel is no exception. That London's writing about the present, but using the lens of the future. But one of the important influences on the Iron Heel was one of the most popular novels of the late 19th century, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, which imagines a socialist paradise that has come about in 100 years from, in the year 2000. Bellamy, it's a Rip Van Winkle story in which Bellamy's narrator falls asleep and is somehow in suspended animation for over 100 years, and then he awakens in the year 2000, and all of the problems of his present have been eradicated, and everyone is living in a harmony that is recognizably socialist, although Bellamy never uses the word. And and we're told very little about how this new great new world came about, but it's clear that people realized that it was in their rational self-interest to start acting together. Whereas London's version of the same thing, and everybody read Bellamy. I want to back up for a second. Bellamy's novel was more than a bestseller. It was a book that created social movements. There were Bellamy clubs and people and discussion groups, people meeting to try to contemplate the future that Bellamy was imagining in their own present. That this was an event book beyond what the author could have dreamed of. So that London would have read looking backward seems obvious. In any case, looking backward was in the atmosphere. It was in the intellectual atmosphere that London was writing in. And for London to imagine his own socialist paradise, or his effort to imagine that socialist paradise, it's characteristic of London, the artist, that socialist paradise can only come about through apocalyptic struggle. Because London, as a writer, is always concerned with that kind of struggle in a way that Bellamy was not.
There are three more books that I'd just like to get your comment on. But before I do, maybe you'll touch on them yourselves. Are there any books that we haven't spoken about, or any works of London that you'd like to at least bring up? Because one of the reasons I do shows like this is so that people can stumble upon things and find some of these works. So before I ask my question about three other works, let me just ask either of you: is there any work of London's, either short story, journalism, or the novels that you would recommend that are essential London that we haven't talked about yet?
Well, I'd say The Valley of the Moon is clearly a major work by an American author, and I know that book is taught in California because it's largely about how to manage land in California. After London returned from his Snark voyage, he had pretty much abandoned the idea of becoming a global author, and except for two quick productions of short stories, Son of the Sun and Smoke Baloo, he turned to novel writing and knocked off a succession of 5 or 6 novels in a row without writing a short story. He would return to writing short stories in 1915, but so that sequence of novels is very interesting, and the peak of that novel production, I think, is Valley of the Moon, where you have two characters who are born and raised in the Oakland slums, and then abandon the labor struggles that are graphically narrativized in the early chapters, and they abandon Oakland and set off with backpacks on their back like a couple of hippies, and go to Carmel and meet the Lotus Eaters, and then go up north. They're looking for the perfect place to live, a kind of anecdote to or a more realistic conception of Bellamy's utopian socialist paradise. And like London, not surprisingly, they find it in the Valley of the Moon, which is Sonoma Valley in Sonoma County, north of San Francisco, where London built his ranch and his dream house. So I think that's a key work. And then its twin, you won't have a Jack London story operating by itself in his oeuvre. So the twin to Valley of the Moon is Little Lady of the Big House, which is his final work, which is kind of the iron heel of California farming history. This is the story of how capitalism co-opts that utopian socialist dream of Saxon and Billy Roberts in Valley of the Moon.
So I'm going to speak up for the short story, The League of Old Men, which is actually known, but which I think is typical of London's Northland tales that are told from the point of view of the native peoples. That there's a real sensitivity to the not only the emotions but also the politics of displacement. And The League of Old Men has as its central character a tribal elder who's given himself up after engaging in years of what must be described as terrorism against people whom he recognized as the illegal occupiers of his land. And the way that London writes the story, your sympathies are entirely with the terrorist. And it's I think an important story for us to read today, because if we are going to understand and work with the politics of our own time, the politics of terrorism, we need to be able to take something more than a Manichaean view. Otherwise, we will not be successful in any term, in any meaning of the word success.
The three works that I wanted to mention to round out this segment, I wanted to start. We mentioned the Star Rover, and in the Iron Heel, we get that dystopian sense of the future, and there are covert organizations wandering around, and you get some of that in the Star Rover too, which sort of uh, has that kind of feel too. Where would you put a work like the Star Rover in sort of the London canon? Do you think it's one of his better works, or a lesser work? Is it a major work, or what?
Well, at the very least, well, at first it's a bit off-putting because it doesn't feel like a novel as you read it. It feels like a succession of short stories. It's a frame story, and the frame is is odd. It's such an odd choice. The narrator, it's told in the first person. The narrator is Darrell Standing, who is a former professor of agronomy at the University of California. Interestingly, who kills his colleague for unspecified reasons, except to say that the red wrath rose in me and I slew him, and it probably was over a woman. But as Darrell Standing says, that's neither here nor there. The real point is what is happening to me in this awful prison and penal system in America. Interestingly enough, the building that he kills his colleague in is the same building that he reported on in November 1902 for the Hearst newspapers. And it's the mining building at University of California, Berkeley. So anyway, so that's the frame, and Darrell Standing is tortured in prison by being put in a straitjacket, which at that point was illegal, but for up until 1913 had been legal. It was legal to put prisoners in straitjackets and leave them in a cell in solitary confinement for however long the authorities wanted to torture a prisoner. So in the straitjacket, Darrell Standing suffers so horribly that he's able to separate his mind from his body, and in a repeat of the plot from Before Adam, he's able to go back in time and live previous lives, which seems like the transmigration of souls or some form of theosophist thinking. And this was just a device, as I said before, to enlist the help of New Thought people we would call New Agers today, in his battle against capital punishment. It does unify through certain subtle techniques of metaphor, I think. The novel does unify. I mean, the principal metaphor is the cell, both the bodily cell and the cell in which Standing finds himself. Where to put it in? It's just, I resist ranking London's work. It certainly does work as a novel. I think it's an important contribution to American socialist and progressive thought.
How about you, Leonard?
So what I would say is that the literary critic has always to be honest and own up. And I haven't read the Star Rover, so
okay.
I think I've spoken enough for both of us, or more than two people.
I liked hearing what you said about it.
Well, when I was a boy, there was a film I remember seeing as a kid with Telly Savalas and Diana Rigg called Assassination Bureau, and I had no idea that it was based from a Jack London story. Speaking of secret societies, it was apparently, from what I'm looking up, an unfinished story that was, I guess, his wife hired someone to finish it after his death. And again, I had no idea that this movie, which was an okay movie, as I remember, you're 5 or 6 years old when I saw it. Have you ever read that work? And if so, how does that sort of fit into his canon?
I glanced at it once, and I can't really say very much about it, except is that unfinished works have a poor provenance in American literature. That Raymond Chandler's estate hired Robert B. Parker, who was certainly a detective fiction writer of considerable reputation, whose affection for Chandler was clear from every page that he wrote. And Chandler's estate hired Parker to finish Chandler's last two novels. And the results, although respectable, have never really been. No one's paid much attention to them. And a lot of people have tried to figure out what Dickens, who Dickens was going to have do it in The Mystery of Edwin Drood, which he left unfinished, and that's probably the great the ore work of unfinished canonical fiction. It's always too bad when authors leave works incomplete, because nothing good ever happens as a result, except maybe having a movie made.
Huh.
With Telly Savalas, no less.
Yeah.
But London was preoccupied with secret societies because that's how he viewed capitalism, as this force governed by a select few who made decisions out of hearing and out of sight from the vast majority of Americans that pretty much destroyed people's lives, just ran roughshod over the worker. And the Iron Heel is the Assassination Bureau is about that. The Iron Heel is about that. And so one of the great things in the Iron Heel is that the workers find themselves pitted against other workers, and without knowing exactly why. But London knows why, because that's the strategy of capitalism, to divide and conquer. And that's one of the reasons why London's work socialist work is read today, is because it does carry that message.
In looking up information for the show, the biggest surprise that came to me was that supposedly, according to a few sources that I've looked online, the best-selling book of London's career was something called The Burning Daylight, which I've not read, and I'm shocked that it would have outsold Call of the Wild or some of the other more famous works, at least to me, that I've known. What can you tell me about this work, and is it true that this was his best-selling work of his lifetime?
I'm shocked to hear that. I'm sure that Jay can gloss that, but I've read Burning Daylight, and Burning Daylight is it's not a terribly memorable novel. It's a kind of feel-good story about a guy who works hard and struggles and makes good and gets the girl. But the idea that he is that this is a bestseller, that this was his all-time bestseller, I'm stunned.
I'd be surprised if that's true, actually.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I found it online, the information, a couple of places, so take it for what you will.
Sure. Yeah, of course. I mean, the point is that London sold outrageous numbers of copies. Though his books were never top 10 bestsellers during his time, they would make weekly bestseller lists. Libraries often published lists of what books people were what were the most popular books, and these lists got published on a weekly basis in newspapers. And so it looks like Call of the Wild, Sea Wolf bestsellers, but in the technical sense, they actually were not. But on the other hand, London did make enough money to become a millionaire. He gave away as much money as he made, pretty much. So Burning Daylight probably was a very successful novel. It was, I believe, his first novel upon his return from the Snark voyage. It's a return to the Klondike. It's a return to rapacious capitalism. It's largely based on the experiences of a friend of his, George Sterling, who worked as a private secretary for a real estate mogul in San Francisco Bay Area. So it's a very well put together novel, but it's a bit simplistic in its conception, for sure.
I will add only that best that sales figures are notoriously difficult to compile for a variety of reasons. The London's career coincides almost exactly with the beginning of bestseller lists, and bestseller lists were envisioned. They were first published in a trade magazine called The Bookman, and the term bestseller came about as a result of marketing by the Bookman. And um, the the actual sales figures that a book may have generated, they were difficult to capture then, and they're difficult to capture now, in part because it's very hard to measure when a book actually gets sold. Because if you're talking about when it gets sold to booksellers, well, booksellers can return it to the publisher if it doesn't sell.
Yeah.
And when it gets sold to book clubs won't return it. It's you've seen books that are sold as remainders. Well, somebody's counting them as sold somewhere. But the result is that if Burning Daylight makes this as London's best-selling book, we should remember that the numbers that were being used to compile those lists are sketchy.
All right, well, let's end it on that note for this segment. And in a final segment, I want to give you both a chance to give your final thoughts on Jack London's life and career. We'll do that in a moment. We've been speaking on the life and career of American author Jack London. Jay Williams and Leonard Cassuto have joined me. Let me just give you both a couple of minutes to just wrap up any final thoughts you have and make any other recommendations for someone who is just coming to the works of London. So, Leonard, if you want to go first.
So, Jack London has suffered in critical opinion for a long time, partly because he's been seen as a writer for young people. And the reason that he's been seen that way is because young people can read his work. But we should, I think, no more consider London to be a writer for children than we should consider Mark Twain to be one. Twain's work was equally accessible to young people and continues to be assigned to them. And if London's accessibility allows him to reach a readership that a more dense and difficult writer like William Faulkner isn't going to get to, then we shouldn't take that as a sign of simple-mindedness, because as we've been suggesting over the past couple of hours, London was a writer of not only ambition and not only contradiction, but also an enduring complexity that I've taught him, as I said, for more than 20 years. He stays interesting to me. And he stays interesting because, as any artist of worth will do, he gives you different ways, different approaches to get at his work, and different things to talk about, different things to think about. So I think London's work remains relevant in today's time, in part because of the sheer expanse of topics that you, Dan, identified as being his typical of him. He had searching curiosity, and a lot of the topics that he raised, from the cruelty of boxing that can lead to deaths in the ring, to the continuing struggle in the West between collectivist and individualistic views of economics and social organization. All of these things remain with us, and London is still one of our most interesting voices in as he reflects on and considers those things in our world today.
Jay?
Like Lenny, I find London rewarding over time. I've worked on him since the early 80s, and I'm constantly surprised by him. Just recently, I found 4 pages of a short story that had appeared to be lost. It was just simply misfiled at the Huntington Library because the archive of London's works is so enormous. It's the single largest collection. It's the largest collection of a single author at the Huntington Library because not only did he published everything and he saved everything, and it's all there. And this short story, which appears in recent issue of Studies of American Naturalism, edited by Keith Newland, is about a young Jewish couple in the Oakland slums and their first encounter with socialism. So the simple range of London's interests is surprising and rewarding. What else? I mean, when you involve yourself with a single author, it's hard to get perspective. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, I want to thank both of you for taking time to talk about Jack London. And below this video, I'll have links to both of your websites as well as to some other Jack London information, and especially Project Gutenberg's list of Jack London's works that can be downloaded onto Kindles and other devices such as that. And I would recommend most people read that. If you've enjoyed this discussion, tomorrow I'll be talking with an expert about the cultural and physical aspects of death, and then on Monday, I'll actually be talking with a couple of experts on the life and times of Judy Garland. So I want to thank you both again for your time and your expertise.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan.